If you've never lost a spouse, if you've never walked in those shoes, sometimes your friends and family are well-meaning, but they don't understand the depth of what that feels like. So to be around others that get it, that understand walking into that quiet house at night, that understand how difficult it is to be alone, can be a really powerful thing. And I always say that vulnerability creates connection.
I have to be really honest. It's hard. It's hard for me sometimes, but I have to say I cannot fix this. Because the reality is that when you love someone, you will grieve them the rest of your life.
Welcome back to This Day and Age, where we continue to bring together experts in all things aging, providing vital information to help you and your loved ones make confident decisions while navigating life's journey. I'm Phil Tower, your host for each of these episodes of This Day and Age. I'm privileged in this episode to be joined again by veteran guest Janet Jaymin. We call her a veteran because she was on a previous episode of This Day and Age. Janet Jaymin is Director of Bereavement Services at Faith Hospice. Jen is a bereavement social worker, also with Faith Hospice. Janet joined us, as we mentioned just a second ago, around this time last year, as we had an opportunity to talk about her new book, co-written with retired meteorologist Terry DeBoer, and they had a conversation on grief and healing. Highly recommend, after you hear this episode, you go back and check that out. Today, we're going to dig a little bit deeper on the topic of grief and how aging adults are affected by it. And there are numerous ways, a lot of ways that you may not even be aware of. So first of all, pleased to welcome Jenny Gruppen. Jen, thanks for being here.
Yeah, great to be here.
And Janet Jaymin, welcome back to This Day and Age.
Thank you. I didn't know if I liked the word veteran. That was kind of aging. No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
That's quite all right. Well, a veteran is somebody who has a lot of experience and
I understand.
And I would say valued wisdom.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, a lot of that. It's funny. I want to have you talk each about your background, but isn't it interesting in the issue of grief and grieving, people, once they've gone through it once or twice, they feel like they're a veteran.
Yes, they do.
I bet you've heard that from
Yes,
people.
Absolutely. Of course.
Yeah. Jen,
I was just teasing you too, Phil.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, okay.
The host is allowed to be teased. There are no penalties for that in this episode. So Jen Gruppen, I'm going to start with you as a bereavement counselor. A little bit about your background. You're with Faith Hospice. You're a team member along with Janet. What does a bereavement counselor do? And then the deep probing part, what got you interested in this line of work?
Sure. I've been with Faith Hospice for about 13 years. I've done hospice work for about 25 years. And what a grief counselor does at Faith Hospice is we check in with people after they've had a loss of a loved one. So we make phone calls to them at the first month, at the fourth month, at the 8th month, and at the 12th month, just to see how they're doing and remind them of our resources of counseling and support groups, and just to check in and process maybe what they're feeling. I think I do a lot of just educating people on what normal grief is, and people just want to know, am I normal?
What an invaluable service. This 26, 27 years ago, did you know you wanted to be a grief counselor?
I did. So I lost a sister to cancer. She was 14. I was a senior in high school. So I went off to college shortly after that and was just very impacted by our hospice experience that we personally had as a family, and knew that I wanted to go that route. I think when you have personal experience, you get grief personally. Mm-hmm. You can speak from a little different platform when you've walked it.
As you look in the rearview mirror now, gone through that grief as a senior, losing a 14-year-old sister, it's still grief. It's still there. And how does that change for someone 10 years down the line, 5 years down the line?
I like to reference grief like an onion. You peel sometimes a layer at a time. Sometimes all you can handle is one layer. But I believe that grief is a journey of healing, and it takes time to heal. And as you work through a layer by layer, sometimes you see the next layer of, ooh, maybe some anger is now surfacing. Maybe some unforgiveness is now surfacing.
Right.
So layer by layer, I think the intent is to keep being intentional, to keep being aware of what might be below the surface, what I might be feeling, and to try to name, what am I feeling, and how am I going to intentionally work through that?
Janet Jaymin is with us. Janet is Director of Bereavement Services at Faith Hospice. You work hand in hand with Jen and other team members. Talk about your role there. Remind us how long you've been there.
Yeah, sure. So I have a master's degree in counseling and with an emphasis on administration from Western Michigan University. I'm also a national board certified counselor, licensed professional counselor, and a certified grief counselor. And I've been with Faith Hospice for almost 15 years. What's interesting is Jen and I have known each other for about 25 years because we started out about the same time. And we were very young when we started our hospice career. That was quite a while ago. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I have the great privilege of overseeing the Van Andel Hope and Healing Pavilion, and we refer to it as the Grief Center. And of course, it hasn't been there very long. It opened up in February of 2023. So I have a fantastic group of bereavement counselors, and Jen is one of those that I work with. And I'm also providing that oversight of our planning and implementation of programs and services that include various support groups, the individual counseling, new workshops that are geared towards topics of grief and loss. And we as a team, we really want to ensure that we are meeting the needs of our Faith Hospice families, also our staff, and in this wonderful community that has supported this grief center all along.
Take us inside the grief center. What happens there if we were to walk in on a normal weekday? I'm assuming there's counseling going on, but probably a lot more than that.
Mm-hmm. There's counseling, there's support groups. One thing I would like to say is that when people come to the grief center, there's a beautiful walkway that I think is just very, it's relaxing, it's calm. We had a brick, people were able to purchase bricks with a loved one's name.
I love that.
And so when you walk along, you can see the names of different people who experienced Faith Hospice, the care of Faith Hospice, or the Bereavement Services, Faith Hospice. And so when you walk along that, it's beautiful. It's very welcoming. So when you come in, it's just a beautiful, welcoming center, very open, spacious, bright chairs, wonderful lighting. We also have a library and a wonderful group room where maybe we can have a smaller support group rather than the large group room we could probably hold 30 people in there for a support group. But that smaller group room is nice for maybe 15 people.
As we think about counseling and grief therapy, I want to focus on that concept of group therapy because, first of all, a lot of people, you guys, Jen and Janet, a lot of people are very hesitant to talk about grief. Or they say, I'm okay, I'm processing it. Or maybe come back to me in 3 months and I can tell you how I feel. What does the group setting do? Does that open up conversation? Does it take time? Or is it different for everybody? What have you observed?
I think it's really about the facilitator. And the facilitator being able to create a safe space for people to feel comfortable and to talk about their feelings. And that person really has to engage every person who comes. And, sometimes people come and they don't want to talk, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And we have to, be very mindful of how people are feeling. You can tell just by body language or short answers sometimes. But the big thing about support groups is that you need to keep coming. And I always tell that to folks, you need to keep coming to the group. And those that are consistent and come get the most out of it.
My favorite thing about a support group is that I think people just really appreciate being around others that understand what they're going through. If you've never lost a spouse, if you've never walked in those shoes, sometimes your friends and family are well-meaning, but they don't understand the depth of what that feels like. So to be around others that get it, that understand walking into that quiet house at night, that understand how difficult it is to be alone, can be a really powerful thing. And I always say that vulnerability creates connection. And people are often looking for connection when they come, and a lot of times they meet people that end up being lifelong friends.
Yeah, and it's interesting because maybe they didn't feel comfortable saying something until that person 4 seats away from them expressed exactly what they were feeling.
Right.
Maybe at a different period in their life. And there's a lot of validation, I would assume, that happens in that group setting. We are unpacking this issue of grief and grieving, one of the most profoundly human experiences that we have. And typically, Janet and Jen, we associate this with death and dying, but as we get older, other things cause grief in our life. Retirement can cause grief. Divorce can cause grief. Dementia can cause grief for not only the person who has been diagnosed with dementia, but caregivers can grieve as well. Can you talk about those different types of grief, and do we counsel with those people differently depending on what brought on their grief? Janet, I'll start with you.
Sure. It's interesting that you mention caregivers because we're starting something new. We are starting a caregiver support group. We added this group because caregivers are at a very high risk of stress and depression, and they have a higher mortality rate than non-caregivers. So we really want to provide access to safe spaces by offering a caregiver support group where caregivers can invest in their emotional well-being, which in turn will increase their quality of life as they are dealing with losses. Ambiguous loss. It's huge. Caregivers are losing a lot. And they're watching someone that they're losing. They're watching a person that they knew as one individual become a different individual. They actually are losing their freedom, and in many respects, their individual life and their individual being. So we think it's really important to offer a caregiver support group, in particular to our Faith Hospice families, the caregivers of the families, where they can have an opportunity to come and talk about the things that they're experiencing. And hopefully we can create that safe space where they have an opportunity to kind of debrief the things that they're going through.
Can you read grief on someone? You might know that they're there for grief counseling, but if you see people or perhaps someone who says, well, I'm not grieving, I'm really okay, are there telltale signs of grief in a demeanor of a person, in the way they speak? Are those things you can read, Jen, after 25 years in this space?
For sure. Yeah, I think everybody grieves and copes. Maybe I'll rephrase that. Everybody copes with grief in a different way. And you have people that like to talk about how they feel. And unfortunately, I would say in the West Michigan cultures can tend to shy away from sharing feelings. And sometimes people have that mindset that, oh, I can get through this on my own. Often when I call people at the 4th month and then maybe again at the 8th month, they'll finally say at the 8th month, they might say at the 4th month, I'm okay. At the 8th month call, they might finally admit and say, really thought I was okay, thought I could do this on my own. But I think, let's say I would make 30 calls a day. Out of those 30 people, sometimes only 5 or 10 might admit I need some help. And I think the key is we're all grieving. A lot of us are grieving different losses, as you mentioned. There's different seasons of life where we go through grief and loss. And it's if we're intentional about taking the time to say, I'm going to work through this. I want to talk through this. I want to grieve well. That's the title of the book that Janet wrote. I want to grieve intentionally and grieve well. And so you can read it. You can read it, but it doesn't mean just because I read it that they're going to be willing to talk about it. I think the key is pushing through some of the mindsets of, I can do this on my own, I don't need help, for people to say, it's okay for me to ask for help and to find someone to process this grief with.
You know, as we were talking about types of grief, whether it was retirement, divorce, dementia, as we mentioned, caregiver grief, even parents having that realization that all the kids have left the house, that empty nest sense can cause, it may not be that crushing grief you experience when losing a family member, a loved one, but it's a strange kind of grief and emptiness that often can bring in dementia. You're nodding in affirmation with me. Janet, have you seen that?
Absolutely. That emptiness nest syndrome is huge because it's about identity. You know, if you're like a mother or father, it's like, that was my identity. My children are gone now. They don't need me. I've heard that. They don't need me anymore. I don't want to put Jen on the spot, but she has experienced that. She has firsthand experience in that empty nest syndrome. And you do feel, you know, like, who am I? Because that was a huge role.
Sure. Yeah. That as I would say, along with retirement that you've mentioned, it can be a loss of identity. Who am I? What's my purpose? How am I going to fill my time? Caregivers, I would say, fall in line with that too. When they've been caregiving for a loved one for multiple years sometimes, and then that person dies, I often hear them call me and say, I don't know what to do with my time. And so I think my biggest suggestion is, it's really important to get out there and see who I am and maybe find, is there a hobby I maybe have always wanted to do? Is there volunteering? Maybe that might interest me. I think when people start getting out there and they realize that their purpose is not just in the role they were just in, their job, their caregiving, or they're raising children, it really helps to find new purpose and meaning in life. But you have to be intentional to go out there and dig into that.
Janet Jaymin is with us. Janet is Director of Bereavement Services at Faith Hospice. That was Jen Gruppen, also bereavement social worker with Faith Hospice, as we unpack a little deeper the whole process of grieving and really giving you some tools to manage that better at any time of the year, and maybe even at certain stages of life where you may not be so aware that you're experiencing it. I want to talk about something in terms of older age and a natural phenomena, which is we lose people around us. We lose family members. The older you get, as people age, your friends age, people die, often expectedly, old age, or maybe unexpectedly. And that is tough because you're realizing the clock is ticking, and there are a lot of different types of grief that come with that. Also, maybe grieving, hey, I'm getting older. I'm not as young as I feel that I am. Can you talk about that, Jen and Janet, and maybe some mechanisms to cope with that? Because that could even happen when you're 50 and an empty nester, and then my parents are gone, my grandparents are gone, and you realize your family is shrinking.
I think when older people they're constantly losing people around them. They're losing friends, they're losing relatives, neighbors. They're seeing it all the time. And I think what comes with that, too, is that loss of independence. And you see that. Loss of a driver's license. I'm no longer able to drive. You know, how can I get to a support group? And sometimes we have to be creative, getting in touch with maybe a daughter or son and say, hey, would you be able to bring Jane Doe to the group? She'd really like to come. But that's really hard. Think about not being able to get around. Then there are folks that, they lose a sense of financial security. What's going to happen to me now? Where am I going to go? Am I going to lose my home? They're huge issues. They're sad issues, extremely sad. And so when people come and talk about those things, you just have to, like Jenny talks about, you have to be really intentional about listening, and then trying to have a open conversation about the things that you can do, what you are capable of doing, and what is in your control. because a lot of these things are people losing control of what they used to have. It's incredibly sad.
Yeah, I think you really characterize it well, because this crosses over so many of those types of grief, which is loss of identity. Identify as a parent, now I'm an empty nester. Identify as Mary's husband, and now Mary is gone. I identify as a father, and I've lost a son or daughter. That is a significant type of loss. That loss of identity as a manager or someone who's did this, or a teacher or whatever, that, as we touched on earlier, retirement. I don't know about you guys. I know a lot of people, and I might be in this camp as well. You think, I'm looking forward to retirement someday, and then you get there and you're like, wait a minute. Is this retirement? That can be, as you said, that uncertainty, that ambiguity can really be difficult. As you said, sad issues, challenging issues. I'm really struck by the fact there are people listening to us right now, Jen and Janet, as bereavement experts, as we talk about this. What words of wisdom would you give to family members who have that just clammed up, doesn't want to talk about it, is mustering on parent or aunt or uncle or maybe even sibling, which is even tougher? Kind of words of wisdom. How can a family member help someone who's grieving and maybe is struggling with expressing that grief? Jen?
Yeah, I think our culture can be pretty typical to avoid some of those hard conversations. We don't like to feel awkward. We don't like to push someone. If they give you their initial response or their wall goes up initially, then we think, oh, okay, I'm stopping there. But I encourage families to push through that wall a few times, to try to chisel it away, maybe slowly, softly. I think it's very important to try to get people to name what they're feeling, to identify, okay, I call it tap into grief. Can we just, even for a few minutes, once a week, talk about, wow, you've been through a lot, Mom. To try to acknowledge, empathize, identify what's the hardest thing that you're going through right now. What's been the most difficult about this? If we just ask them, how are they? That's too easy to give the answer, I'm okay. We need to push with a more intentional question. What's the hardest for you? What are you missing the most about working or your spouse? Or what's the most challenging for you since your children have left the nest? To ask the more intentional questions that they can't answer a yes or no to, they have to answer with a sentence. I am one that's passionate about, we've got to dig below the surface to try to name, what am I really feeling? Now, again, like you said, not everybody's going to do that. But we can start with that slowly. And if we model that, if we then can say, let's say Mom doesn't want to talk. If we can then say, you know what, I'm missing this about Dad the most. I am realizing that this is the hardest part for me. Or this is my favorite memory about Dad. Sometimes we can start to model that for loved ones, and that will help pave the way for them to start sharing.
That is great wisdom. You expressing a good memory can actually perhaps be a catalyst for having your mom or dad talk about that loss. And I'm thinking about other things which are a time or an expiration date. We may have touched on this previously, Janet. A lot of people think grief has an expiration date. You know, Mom, it's been 2 years. You got to get out and start living life. It's been 2 years. Or it's been 1.5 years. Or Mom, it's been 5 years. Why can't you take Dad's things out of the bedroom? What kind of wisdom do you have for people who are operating in that mindset? Because a family member is inclined to want to push there, to try to have that sense of normalcy return, yet maybe pushing in the wrong way, right?
Correct. I want to jump back to your question with Jenny, too, that it is important, particularly for children. I think children want to come in and fix. And they want to say, well, Mom is feeling XYZ. Really? Did Mom say XYZ? No. But this is how Mom is feeling. And so sometimes if I'm talking to Mom by myself, I can get a completely different picture. And the issue is that maybe that daughter, son, just isn't taking the time to sit in the presence of their parent to listen. So sometimes I encourage people, just listen. You don't have to fix anything. Just be present with them. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, exactly.
To what you were saying.
And I think that goes back to there's a lot of people put a lot of shoulds on grief. And that's my number one rule I dismantle for people is there's not a should. We have a lot of well-meaning family members that will say, you should be getting rid of their things. You should be getting out more. Mm-hmm. Everybody grieves differently. And we need to allow them the journey for them to grieve the way they need to grieve. And children often want to fix it. And so I usually love to talk to the children then more if they're wanting me, can you please call mom? Sometimes I'll try to push, could we just process a little bit so that I can help that son or daughter to identify, you know what, this is probably feeling pretty helpless for you, that you want to fix this. But it's okay to let mom or dad do this journey the way they need to do it. And work on your own hurt and grief and disappointment and how helpless that feels for you.
And Jen, I love the advice you had, which is don't ask, hey, Mom, how you feeling? Hey, Dad, how you feeling? Ask specifically, Mom, what do you miss most about Dad not being around the house?
What's the hardest for you today, Mom? Yeah, be specific. Be specific.
Great wisdom. Jen Gruppen is a bereavement counselor with Faith Hospice. We're also with Janet Jaymin, Director of Bereavement Services at Faith Hospice, as we talk about grieving. And we are here having this conversation at the end of the year. The holidays, not always the most wonderful time of year. A lot of triggers may come up that trigger a loss, maybe even 3, 5, 15 years ago. Can you touch on the grief season, which is often the holiday season, the end of the year, and how grief and the holidays kind of intersect in a bad way and how to cope with that?
Holidays are very nostalgic. And I do want to go back, Phil, because you had asked about the timetable on grief, too. And there is no timetable on grief. And, I think sometimes people come to us because they want us to fix it. And I know I have to be really honest. It's hard. It's hard for me sometimes. But I have to say I cannot fix this. And because the reality is that when you love someone, you will grieve them the rest of your life. And that's the same with holidays. When those holidays come and you have that empty space of not having that person there with you, that's a horrid feeling, and you miss them forever. Sometimes I do try to have people focus on the goodness of that relationship. If someone was married 50 years, I really want them to think about the 50 years as opposed to just this moment of time of death. Don't give death all this power when you had 50 years with the person that you loved. So sometimes I try to reframe or get people to reframe some of their thinking to that, to start thinking about those more joyous times that they had at their holidays. Can some people do it? Absolutely. Are there others that can't? Sure. It's a hard time of year.
So Jen, if somebody is at this point maybe fresh into grieving the loss of a loved one, family member, could be a spouse, and it's the holiday time, perhaps there's different advice you're going to give them in terms of coping as opposed to 5 years out. And I guess the concern I have, and I'd like you to address this, is if you don't address that grief right on, especially during the holidays, or maybe have some good coping mechanisms, that can end up triggering negative thoughts holiday after holiday after holiday. Can you talk about that?
Sure. The first, everyone talks about the first years, holidays, anniversaries, birthdays, extremely difficult. And I think we need to be really sensitive to those grieving those first holidays, to ask them, what do you need during this time? Because I have people that want to do things just the same, that's comforting to them in their grief. But you have other family members. Number one, we have to remember everybody grieves differently. So while you have someone that might want to keep all traditions the same, most people, if their grief is really fresh to Christmas, it's pretty common that they will say, I can't do the traditional Christmas the way that it was. So I encourage families, be flexible to say, maybe we have to relook at how we do this year. Maybe we do traditions different. Sometimes people do a trip. I have several people this Christmas saying, I got to get out of this. I got to get out of here. I've got to just be somewhere different. I have to maybe go to a family party for only an hour instead of maybe I would go for 4, because grief is exhausting and people they don't have the same emotional energy or stamina to do the shopping. I know many people that I'm counseling right now that will have said to me, I don't have it in me to decorate the house. And that's okay. I remind people that just because you felt it this year, because the first is the hardest, doesn't mean that you'll feel that way next year.
I'm so glad you said that about the decorating, because again, is that adult child trying to fix things. Mom, we're going to put up the tree. You'll feel better. And mom really may not want the tree or any decorations around.
And that's
so
okay.
Respect that space, right?
Yes, that's okay. We have to listen and respect and ask what's going to be the best for you. And of course, if you have a large family and there's multiple siblings, you're all maybe going to grieve differently. When I was grieving my sister's death, my mom, I would call, was a very public griever. So she wanted to talk about my sister quite often, watch the videos, do the balloon releases. I was a more private griever. And in families, you're going to find both. And so we had to figure out on a holiday when my mom wanted to watch the videos of my sister, and that wasn't comfortable for me, that it was okay for me to go downstairs and do something different. That was important to mom, and I needed to respect that for her. And she also respected me that was too much for me. So it's having conversations as a family to say, what do we each need and how can we be flexible this year to make this as most comfortable as possible?
You know how powerful that was, what you just said. I'm hearing that, and I hope our listeners are taking that away. You could have a family grieving a loved one, get in an argument over why did Jen go downstairs and doesn't respect mom watching the video? Because Jen has a right to grieve in her own way. And I hope everyone hearing us is going to understand that, because whether you have a family of 3 or 13, everyone in that family, nuclear or extended family, is going to grieve differently. There should be no shade or no shame thrown on anyone for grieving differently. You guys, I could talk about this for another hour. I'm going to ask you, Janet, to kind of give some summary wisdom for people listening, especially people who are in this season of grief. What kind of words of wisdom would you share with them? And then, Jen, I'll ask you to add some as well.
Sure. I always encourage people to do what feels right. You know, if it doesn't feel right, don't do it. You don't have to do the same traditions. If there's a tradition that you don't like, get rid of it and start something different. If you don't want to make a fruit cake, don't make it. Okay? And then my big one is that no expectations. Have no expectations. You don't have any expectations, you will not have any disappointments. We have so many expectations for the holidays. We think everything has to be perfect, particularly around Christmas. Everything has to be perfect. We have to get gifts for everybody. The tree has to be perfect. The decorations have to be perfect. I need to cook the perfect meal. And you know something's going to happen. There's going to be maybe someone didn't get a gift, or maybe I didn't get them the right gift. No expectations, no disappointments. Just be. Just be.
One strong advice that I have is be intentional. Be intentional to ask the hard question. And a lot of times at family gatherings, people that are interacting with those that have lost loved ones will say, well, I don't want to ask her how she is because she might cry. Or she looks okay right now, so I don't think we should bring it up. I feel the opposite of that. I like to be intentional to say, hey, and maybe you let the family know that ahead of time, to say, we're not going to spend the whole family gathering grieving or crying, but we're going to spend a half hour talking about dad. And so maybe I want you all kids to bring your favorite memory about dad or grandpa. Maybe you have a little activity or craft for kids to do that they can draw a picture, write something to grandpa, create an ornament for grandpa. Allow space to be intentional for people to share and talk about how they're feeling, but not stay stuck in it, that we have to cry or that it has to affect the whole holiday gathering. But ask the questions. Don't let it be the elephant in the room where you're in a gathering and you don't want to ask that person how they are. People that are grieving want to know they're cared about, and that even to just say, I'm thinking about you. I know this must be hard for you. To tap into it and acknowledge the loss, and be really flexible, as I already emphasized. Be flexible and ask people what they need and how can I best support you? What are you needing in this grief for this holiday season? How can I help you through it?
That is Jenny Gruppen. Jen is a bereavement counselor at Faith Hospice. Also joining us on this episode of This Day and Age, Janet Jaymin, Director of Bereavement Services with Faith Hospice. And it's important that we remind you the Van Andel Hope and Healing Pavilion is indeed open to families that are served by Faith Hospice, but it's also open to any member of the community. Don't forget about that. It's an amazing resource to have in our community. So we are very excited to wrap up this episode and round out our second season of This Day and Age, where we have hit on some very important topics all about aging in America, and hopefully along the way you've gained some wisdom and learned a little bit for yourself or learned enough to share with loved ones along the way. We invite you to stay tuned as we kick off Season 3 in 2024. In the meantime, you can visit thisdayandage.org to catch up on past episodes. Also, be sure to subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss an episode. And will you do us a favor? Share this episode or any of our other episodes of This Day and Age with family and friends so they, like you, can stay informed and make confident decisions as they age. And until next time, for This Day and Age, I'm your host, Phil Tower. Thank you for listening. We'll catch you again on our next episode.